Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Leonard Wolfson Auditorium here at Wolfson. It's a great pleasure to have you all here with us today, and a great pleasure to be introducing Dr Christoph Bachhuber. Christoph, with Martin Goodman, leads Wolfson's Ancient World Research Cluster. And today he'll be speaking for about 50 minutes, I think, followed by some time for some Q&A before we make our way over to the buttery for something to drink and eat, and around about 6 o'clock with the start. Before coming to Oxford, Christoph taught at the Freie Universität Berlin and at Brown University. Here in Oxford, he teaches for several undergraduate degrees, including archaeology and anthropology, classical archaeology and ancient history, classics, Egyptology and ancient Near Eastern studies, a man of many talents. His particular focus is on the material culture and societies of the ancient Near East and on Aegean prehistory, as well as on archaeological methods and theory. Christoph is currently working on 2 archaeological projects in Turkey and is one of the world's great experts on the Hittites. Some of you might have heard him last December discussing the Hittites with Melvin Bragg and colleagues on Radio 4's In Our Time. Today he will be speaking about the unfolding story of the Hittite Empire and its collapse. And Christopher, welcome. It's all yours.
Hey. Thank you very much, Hugh. Microphone good? Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for this opportunity to discuss aspects, or talk really about aspects of my research. So I'm going to work with the assumption that some of you probably have not thought about the Hittites much up until this point. There are several experts, of course, in the audience who will know quite a bit about the subject matter, but I will work from the assumption that some of you may not be that familiar with this particular field. So I'll begin with really an attempt to explain what we mean by Hittite as philologists, as linguists, as archaeologists of this particular civilization. And we'll see that I think differs a little bit from who the Hittites were. And there's some nuances here really in language and culture and material culture that I want to tease out a little bit. And I think it'll become clear why Hittite may not be the most straightforward ethnonym for this region and time period. Perhaps more straightforward is the Hittites as a political entity. And this will, of course, be the ultimate aim of my talk, is to try to explain this as an imperial phenomenon and some of the implications for that, of course, as an empire in interactions with neighboring people, cultures, regions, etc. And returning to some of the nuances of what a Hittite is or is not, we'll be introducing Luvian as both a language, but also potentially also a culture. And what does Luvian have to do with this Hittite phenomenon? And then I want to finish off ultimately with an attempt to explain why indeed this particular imperial project collapsed so catastrophically and suddenly. It is also an opportunity to, of course, when you're addressing empire, it's a very, very big topic. So I'm not going to be covering every aspect of the Hittite Empire. And what I want to lead this conversation towards is a neighboring region to the south of the Hittite core. This is the area of my own fieldwork, and I will be introducing aspects of my fieldwork in an attempt to understand what Hittite is or is not, what indeed the Hittite Empire was, and its impact on neighboring regions. So the discussion will be focused on a region to the south of what is the core of the Hittite state and empire, which is the area of my fieldwork. So what is Hittite? It is an ethnonym. We borrow this ethnonym from the Old Testament. If for those of you that are not specialists or ancient world experts, it probably rings a bell as something vaguely biblical. And indeed, it is a term that we have borrowed, for lack of a better term, from the Old Testament. So you can see, not showing up very well on the screen, but you can see some of the, where Hittite shows up in various passages. Hittite people, tribes, cultures, even kings and armies appear in the Old Testament. But up until the mid-19th century, there was no understanding really of where these people lived. There was a supposition that the Hittites lived somewhere in the deserts of northern Syria. But the Hittites simply were not an archaeological reality in the same way that by the middle of the 19th century, the Assyrians had become an archaeological reality, the Egyptians had become an archaeological reality. The Hittites simply were not that until some spectacular archaeological discoveries, which I will outline very briefly. So the discovery story really begins here in the middle of the 19th century when Heinrich Bruch was really the first person to, let's say, grant some historical evidence outside of the Old Testament. The first one to suggest that there is a historical reality of the Hittites that exists outside of the Old Testament, and indeed he equated. And we'll come back to this very inscription later in the talk, but he equated the kingdom of Khita, which shows up as an adversary, in fact an imperial adversary, to the New Kingdom Egypt. He was the first one to equate the kingdom of Khita with the Hittites from the Bible. It suggested there is a relationship. Obviously, there is a sort of cognate relationship between Khita and Hittite. And he was the first one to really suggest that that is indeed who we are reading about in the Egyptian sources. But it was Archibald Sayce who, there's of course a nice Oxford connection, a Syriologist at Oxford, who was really, I would say, the first person to bring a much larger archaeological reality, if we want to call it that, to the Hittites by linking the kingdom of Khita from the Egyptian sources to inscriptions. These hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions that you see represented here. There's a map up showing Turkey and northern Syria and the sort of distribution of these Luvian inscriptions. He quite confidently associated the Hittites, of course, from the Bible, also now from the Egyptian sources to these hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions. So I won't read out the quote, but it is quite succinct and quite confident that there is a real relationship between Khita, Hittites from the Old Testament, and the distribution of Luvian inscriptions that you could see in the color coding on the map. So we're going to go back a couple of decades now, pre-Bruch, pre-Sayce, and this is the first real, let's say, archaeological illustration of a place that we, of course, now know to be a Hittite city. But there were a few decades up until the late 19th century where travelers, so both of these individuals were really more of the traveler type rather than the scholar type, recorded these really unusual monuments in central Turkey that they could not associate with the Greeks or the Romans in any material way, but yet you could see them trying to fit it into these sort of classical narratives, right? So text here, so there's a reference to Herodotus. This must be that city. And then there's Hamilton with the reference from Livy. This must be that city. However, the visual culture, the material culture, simply stood so far outside of anything classical that most people at the time really didn't believe them, or at least they disagreed with their interpretations that we are dealing here with some classical period civilization. So that mystery continued. However, it took then two archaeologists, one Ottoman Turkish and one German, to set out to this very place, right? So here we are, 4 decades, or let's say 7 decades later, and recognizing that this is certainly not anything classical. What the rock reliefs, etc., that these earlier explorers had recorded, and set out to discover a Hittite city, or indeed a Hittite capital, believing that this would be a likely candidate. So 1907, 2 weeks into the excavation, they focused on the highest point of the site, and we're going to come back to the topography of Boğazköy or Hattusa, but they focused on the building that you see, of course, in a more recent archaeological plan on the left. It is the highest point of Hattusa. And 2 weeks into the excavations, they really made one of the most remarkable, in fact, I would say spectacular, at least for Bronze Age civilizations of the 20th century. So their intuition led them to this building. They recognized that this building was certainly going to be important. It was the highest building of the city. It commanded, like an acropolis, it commanded the entire city that they could see very clearly archaeologically on the surface. And indeed, they were excavating the palace of Hattusa. And within 2 weeks of the excavations, came down on this enormous archive of cuneiform tablets. So this really now is where the Hittitology begins. This is really where the history of the civilization begins in a very real archaeological sense, but of course also philological sense, epigraphic sense, linguistic sense. And here I've just put several, there are 25 or more publications out of this particular archive. Here's just a sampling of what this enormous archive has produced historically. And this is just a nice, where something just closes very nicely in the discovery story. So if you remember, it was Bruch who first recognized the kingdom of Kita in the middle of the 19th century in Egyptian inscriptions, particularly at Karnak and the Ramesseum. That was indeed a peace treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians, and a copy of the very same peace treaty was found in that archive that was discovered at Hattusa. So this is the hieroglyphic Egyptian copy that you see on the left, and then on the right, it is the copy in the archive of the palace at Buyukale at Hattusa. Incidentally, there's additional copies of this remarkable peace treaty. It is now housed, a modern copy of this peace treaty is now housed in the United Nations for the rather, I think, a straightforward reason that this is really, in terms of peace treaty between two great powers, two superpowers, this is the first one in global history. And so we can see it actually in bronze and much larger than the original in the United Nations Secretariat in New York, and then the original in Istanbul, in the Topkapı Palace. Okay, so what do we mean by Hittite? Now, there are various ways to approach this ethnonym. Some are, let's say, more problematic, and some are less problematic. And I think it should become clear why Hittite itself is a slightly ambiguous ethnonym or term for a given people. So we can begin with Hittite, quote unquote, as a language. Now, of course, we have, Hittite is not, it is an etic term if we want to be academic about it. It is a term that we have given to this particular language or culture or civilization. It is a term borrowed from the Old Testament. The Hittites did not call themselves Hittite. And the closest they got to that was calling themselves the people of the land of Hatti. But there is a language, and the language is not Hittite because they had no concept or no word for themselves as Hittite, but it is Nessite or Neshite. And this is the language spoken by the ruling dynasty, and there is only one ruling dynasty in the Hittite Empire, Hittite state and empire. It is the language that is spoken by that ruling dynasty. So this is already getting to be quite a narrow definition of what Hittite is or isn't. Of course, Hittite is not Hittite, it's Nessite. You know, the Hittites referred to it as Nessite. So, and a further point too, that as history unfolds into the latter part of the Hittite state and empire, Luvian enters the picture as a language that is spoken by many in the ruling dynasty, and we'll see where Luvian as a related language, but a separate language, really now becomes a part of what Hittite is or isn't, for that matter. So this distinction between Hittite and Luvian will be returning to this problem. There are specialists in the audience that will also, I think, when we have the conversation, we'll be able to speak to this nuance and how, in fact, these two languages are being used. Nessite, we'll call it as the indigenous quote-unquote language of the ruling dynasty, and Luvian as a language that becomes more and more prominent as the history of this civilization unfolds. And we'll see how that happened, or at least make a stab at actually quite a difficult phenomenon to explain later in this talk. Okay, so we're going to move now onto the Hittites as a political entity, or indeed a political geographic entity, if we want to call it that. And here we can think of it in two ways. There is the land of Hatti, which is really where the ruling dynasty ruled. It is, and it isn't just Hattusa. There was sort of almost a pentapolis of cities that we'll return to. So there's the land of Hatti, which we call it the Hittite core, and then there is the empire, right? So beyond Hatti, you can see on the map the sort of the annexation, the sort of imperial appropriation of territories, of lands, of peoples beyond that Hatti in the middle. So here again, we might be slightly more comfortable talking about Hittite as a thing, as a political thing, as something where you have a Hittite core in the land of Hatti, and then you have a kind of expansionary Hittite phenomenon that is generically an empire. So this ruling dynasty referred to their homeland as the land of Hatti, and here is another. Where we're beginning to glimpse this sort of the appropriations. I mean, really layers and layers of appropriations of what Hittite is or isn't. Hatti, incidentally, is Hattic was a language that was spoken, a non-Indo-European, a language that had linguistically nothing to do with the Hittite or the Luvian, which are Indo-European languages. Hattic or Hattic people appear to have been people who lived in that central area before the Hittites emerged as a state in this region, and they referred ultimately to their own land as the land of Hatti, which isn't in fact their own, right? So they're already, in a sense, appropriating another people, another language, another culture in the definition of their own homeland. So again, we're getting now a glimpse at this sort of the appropriations that are being made by this civilization. So there are a number of cities, and these are all cities that have been excavated that I've shown on the map on the right, and some of them, are we have good historical names for these places. In other words, there will be maybe cuneiform tablets found in some of these cities, and some of them we are sort of guessing at what their name is as the city, and what did the Hittites call them. But nevertheless, these are 5 cities in the land of Hatti that have all experienced various degrees of archaeological excavation. So the capital, the real center, the core of this Hittite state and empire, this kind of political project, was the city of Hattusa, and it, except for a very brief period, and then we'll come back to that very brief period when Hattusa was not indeed the capital. This was really where all the decisions were made. I mean, this was the metropole, this was the imperial core of the Hittite state and empire for almost 400 years. This was, and now we're returning back to the palace, and if you remember, this is where that spectacular discovery of the archives was made, building A, actually, we can see it in the plan down there. But again, just to give you a sense, of course, we're dealing now with a lot of archaeologically reliable reconstructions of this particular building. But if you get a sense, of course, you've seen a lot of the images, the landscapes. I mean, this is very much a city built on a mountain, and the palace itself is very much the Acropolis of that. You know, you could just get a sense, of course, of the sort of topographic plans on the left, and then the archaeological reconstruction up there. This is this is of course the nerve center. This is the royal residence, all of the above for the ruling family of the Hittites. So one distinction that we can make is between, sorry, if I go back to this plan, so the palace really topographically dominated what is called the lower city. And this is what is also called the old city, because there is habitation in that lower city from the early Bronze Age on. So for at least 1,000 years, there has been settlement in that lower part of the Unterstadt, right, the lower city, the lower town of Hattusa. And the palace is very much looming over a landscape that had been inhabited for at least 1,000 years. And the upper city is the new city, right? So it is really only probably in the latter half of the 13th century that the upper city was developed in this really spectacularly monumental sense. And we can see, of course, the Luvian inscriptions that we were talking about a little earlier, and of course all the gate elaboration, this temple construction projects. This was all a later development, I think tied very closely to the imperial project, and I'm going to come back to the relationship between the upper city and the Hittites as an empire later in the talk. So, but it is an important distinction, I think, the older town and the newer town, and this newer upper city really is the most monumentalized, and also I think a real reflection of the fate of the empire, and we'll come back to that later in the talk. Okay, so this is just a little tour of other cities. So there's another place where there was a small archive wouldn't be the right word, but it was sort of smattering of cuneiform tablets, enough anyway to get some sense of this, the function of this particular city. And it was a place seemingly where the royal family would visit occasionally, right? So the analogy is maybe could be described as something like a summer palace, but very much on the cultic itinerary of the ruling elites. They would travel around the land of Hatti, and this was one of the places where the ruling dynasty would spend some periods of time in their sort of cultic itinerary around the land of Hatti. Here's a site where we're sort of guessing somewhat at what the Hittites called this place. No inscriptions, no text found here, but Alajahuyuk is clearly a cult center. Next, I would say, second only to Hattusa in the scale of its monumentality, in its relief, in the visual culture, in the statuary. Really, truly a spectacular site. Okay, so we're going to move now beyond the land of Hatti into the imperial project of the Hittite state and empire. And so we see the shaded area, which is, again, these are endlessly disputed, how much and to what territories were actually annexed or under some hegemonic control. But this is a pretty good approximation, let's say. I never really liked this kind of jutting out bit there. I think there's something more diffuse and interesting in the western part of Turkey. But you get a sense, anyway, of the of how much territory had been appropriated in this imperial project. So where the Hittites are probably most well known, and if you have any, sort of the non-experts in this audience, if you've heard of them, if you didn't hear about them in the Bible, then you might have heard them in this historical context, in this great imperial conflict between Ramses II and Hattusili III, as the Hittite imperial project is moving down the Levant from the north. The Egyptian imperial project is moving is moving north. And then there is the clash, the classic imperial frontier between these two empires at the Battle of Kadesh. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it is, again, it is arguably, probably what the Hittites are most well known, outside of the Bible. It is where most people, if they have any knowledge of the Hittites, non-specialist knowledge, will come from this very famous battle. And the Egyptians took a lot of pain to record this battle in various temples, not just Karnak, but I say Abu Simbel and Abydos. Ramses II took a lot of, anyway, it is all over the kind of the monumental landscape of Karnak and Abu Simbel and Abydos. And instead of that, I want to return now to the peace treaty, which again is certainly related to that battle, but it is, I think, mistakenly referred to as the Treaty of Kadesh. The Treaty of Kadesh, it didn't resolve that battle, right? It was the treaty was signed maybe 3 or 4 decades after the Battle of Kadesh, but there is clearly a relationship, right? There was that conflict, let's say, wasn't really resolved. It was in a sense a draw between these two powers, and then some decades later, a peace treaty was signed, and that is indeed what we saw earlier. Okay, so we think about the Hittites as an imperial entity, and they really did follow what we call a very standard playbook of empire. And just, of course, the Hittites did not represent their conquests in the way, let's say, for example, the Assyrians did. So I'm sort of stealing a little bit the visual culture of the Neo-Assyrians to show what the Hittites revealed in their own archives. The sorts of things they were doing was recorded quite meticulously in their own analytic texts, diplomatic texts, all from that Hattusa archive. There is no visual culture like there is with the Assyrians, so I'm going to be stealing some of the Assyrian visual culture to illustrate some of the imperial strategies of the Hittites. And as an imperial project, it did not extend much beyond its immediate neighbors, right? So here are the entities that, of course, all neighbor the land of Hatti. I'll be spending most of the time talking about Luvian language and culture, perhaps, but we'll also be revisiting some of the Hurrian aspects of what a Hittite is, actually, and then maybe talking a little bit about the Koska territories to the north when trying to understand what happened at the very end. So, again, in very broad historical brushstrokes, what I think is most significant for our purposes is some of the cultural and linguistic associations of the two places where the Hittites established vice-regencies. Tarantasa, which is south of the land of Hatti, was a Luvian territory, if we can call it that. Whereas Carchemish, the other seat of the Hittite vice-regency, was very much within the kind of Hurrian culture and history. And we're going to see how we'll sort of be connecting the dots to some extent and trying to see how these vice regencies actually, or these territories, began to kind of infiltrate the land of Hatti, culturally, linguistically, etc., as part of this imperial project. So all empires are brutal. There is just no getting around these particular strategies of uprooting thousands, tens of thousands, if we're going to, if the analytic and diplomatic texts of the Hittites are reliable, tens of thousands of people were uprooted from their homes and deported mostly to the land of Hatti, seemingly to be used as farming labor, but of course also they would have been used in the military, they would have been used for monumental construction projects, etc. But this is the reality for any empire where people were uprooted from their homes, from their landscapes, from their villages, etc., and forcibly deported into the land of Hatti. Along with the deportation of people, communities, the Hittites, and they weren't alone in this, also deported gods. Literally the cult statues from the temples of the places that they annexed, conquered, etc. Again, this is, a sort of stealing Neo-Assyrian visual culture here to illustrate this tactic. Now, the Assyrians had one reason to do this. I think the Hittites may have had another reason to do this, but it was more or less, it was common practice, let's say, to do this. But what is really remarkable, I think maybe that also distinguishes perhaps the Hittite strategy from the Assyrian strategy, is how the god-napped gods, really began to populate the pantheon. And it took very established places within the pantheon of the Hittite state. The most, let's say, the most prominent were probably the Hurrian gods, Hurrian deities that really, had become very well established at the top almost of the pantheon of the Hittites. We can see sort of a representation at the Yazalakaya, a rock sanctuary just outside of the city walls of Hattusa, the paired bowls associated with the Hurrian deity. So the god napping, also, we can really imagine these gods returning, the cult statues even, returning to the city and being given homes in the temples of Hattusa. And this also explains to some extent this proliferation. All of these buildings up at the top there, those are all temples. And those are all temples that were built probably within the century. So there is a relationship between this sort of imperial expansion, the strategies of god-napping, etc., and this proliferation of temple building in the upper city of Hattusa. It's not, of course we're not finding these archaeologically, and we're sort of, there's a little bit of guesswork here, but it's reasonably safe to believe these deities that were being, let's say, taking god-napped from cities were being given homes in the upper city of Hattusa. Of course, these deities of non-Hittite origin, right, from Hurrian territories, Luvian territories, etc. So here's another form of appropriation, and now we're returning to this distinction that we made earlier between what is Hittite and what is Luvian. So Luvian is so Hittite, again, if we want to just use the linguistic terms, is Nessite, right? Nessite is the language spoken by the ruling dynasty of the Hittite state and empire. And by the 13th century, there is a real, there's this fluorescence of Luvian in two forms. One, a monumental form, which is the script you can see here, the hieroglyphic Luvian. There is no hieroglyphic Nessite or hieroglyphic Hittite. the Hittite ruling dynasty by the 13th century, all of their monumental inscriptions are in Luvian rather than Nessite or Hittite. And then there is the cuneiform Luvian, which is the archival language. Of course, we're coming back to the archive with 10,000 tablets, right? A good portion of, well, not, there's significant, there's a significant corpus of Luvian language, cuneiform Luvian language records in that archive, mostly to do with cult practices, religion to some extent, but written in Luvian. Right? So, and there's every reason to believe that by the 13th century, the ruling elites of Hattusa were bilingual. Many of them were bilingual in Hittite and Luvian. So again, when we start, sort of unpacking a little bit, what is Hittite and what isn't Hittite, linguistically, it is quite, it's quite nuanced, really. And why, which is a question that really hasn't been resolved yet. Why were they choosing to use Luvian language in their monumental inscriptions by the 13th century? This is, again, an unresolved question. So this is a broad brushstroke, overgeneralizing, but I think it is fair to say that by the 13th century, this is one consequence of Hittite imperialism, where the deportations, the god-napping, the appropriations, all of this now is turning the land of Hatti into something that it wasn't perhaps before. We don't want to, cosmopolitan is not quite the right word, but certainly it is becoming a linguistically and even culturally complex place. And we're beginning perhaps to see, or beginning to find one maybe explanation or one approach to the problem of why the Hittite state and empire collapsed so catastrophically as it did. So, we'll come back to this, but we can really just begin to imagine the thousands and thousands of people forcibly removed from their homes, deported into the land of Hatti, and all of the turmoil, political, social, cultural, even linguistic, that would have resulted in this in the land of Hatti in the 13th century. So we'll come back to the problem of, this would be one of several considerations as we try to address why this project ended so catastrophically. Okay, so I want to move on now to an historical question that relates quite closely to my own fieldwork and to what I am doing now in Turkey. And that is the relationship between an entity, a political geographic entity called Tarantasa and the Hittite Empire. And now we're going to, if you can see the map, we are now moving south of the land of Hatti into a region that is more or less defined today by the Konya Plain, the city of Konya, in those very landscapes. So I'm going to come back to the point of and this is the problem with any empire. If you think about the Roman Empire using Julius Caesar to try to understand Roman Britain, right? I mean, so much of what we know about the empire is what we can say is Hatti-centric, right? It comes from the archives of the ruling dynasty of the land of Hatti, right? And so this will always be the case in any imperial context where the historical sources are much greater, let's say, much more numerous, much more reliable, we could even say, from the metropoles of the empire than they are from the territories that are being annexed. And this is certainly the case with Tarantasa. So Tarantasa is a place that emerges in the 14th century as a place of a very real interest, and we're going to just sort of do a potted history of this this particular place. But we can see here that Tarhunda, or Tarhund, is a Luvian god. So this was, Tarantasa was the seat or the home, let's say, of this particular Luvian storm god, Tarhund or Tarhunda. Okay, so the potted history, sorry, there's a lot of text there. What we are most interested in is when a particular king, in fact, the very king who fought against who led the Egyptian chariot army in the Battle of Kadesh, decides to move the capital from Hattusa to Tarantasa. So again, this is also a problem that has not been resolved. Originally people thought, it had, of course, something to do with religion. We can think maybe if there's an analogy, it could be Amarna and Akhenaten. Certainly, Luvian, this is the seat of a Luvian deity, right? A Luvian storm god. There is probably something there. But regardless of, we're not here to try to explain why he did this, but he did. He moved the capital from Hattusa to Tarantasa in around 1270. Okay. The seat, the Hittite capital, returns to Hattusa, and in its stead, Tarantasa becomes one of the two vice-regencies. If you remember, we said Carchemish and Tarantasa are the two vice-regencies. A governor, vice-regent, is installed named Korunta, and he does something quite remarkable and begins to assert his own, let's say, political independence from Hattusa, and becomes indeed a rival of the land of Hatti and Hattusa. And we're going to see some of the monumentality of that in a second. But even more remarkable is when, within decades of the collapse of the Hittite state and empire, Hatti is at war with Tarantasa. So, Tarantasa very much, again, this is all sort of Hatti-centric, this is all coming from the Hattusa perspective, but it very much features in that appropriation of Luvian language, land, religion, people even, right? This is very much a part of that. It is the ultimate appropriation, right? Establishing a capital, the capital of the empire there for a couple of decades, but then it becomes this vice-regency, but then it breaks away. It breaks away and it asserts its independence as its own, let's say, as a regional rival to the land of Hatti. So this is the million-dollar question. There is no archaeological location of Tarantasa. It has not been discovered. So we had. And the colleagues, so you could see there, started a project in 2016. This wasn't the only thing we were trying to do with this project, but certainly it was up there. We set out, to some extent, to find some clues to the location of this particular city, Tarantasa. And those clues were, of course, we have the Hatti-centric ones. We can reconstruct these political geographies of Hittite interactions with Tarantasa. There's all kinds of geographic information in treaties, for example, between the two entities. You sort of begin to narrow down a broad region of where Tarantasa must be. There's also the sort of more in situ evidence, hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions in the Konya region. And then, of course, a lot of what we did was to fill in the picture to some extent of this landscape through our own survey fieldwork. So the initial consideration, and we talked about a period when Tarantasa began to break away from Hatti as its own entity, as a sort of quasi-independent political entity. And this is playing out in hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions in the Konya region. And what we see on the map, circled in large, is the inscriptions of Tudalia IV, right? So to the north, and in yellow, it is the hieroglyphic inscriptions of Korunta. Korunta being the vice-regent but breakaway king, let's say, of Tarantasa. So you can already begin to get a sense of a conflict that is playing out just in the distribution of hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions in this landscape. So that is Hatip is where you can just barely make out the relief above the spring And there is, of course, a drawing of that particular relief and the inscription. And it's just a blow-up of that very relief of Karunta, the king of Tarantasa. Okay, so we can see there Tudhaliya IV, and again, this tension, this conflict playing out to some extent in the distribution of these monuments. So if we move ahead a couple of hundred years, post-Hittite, into the Iron Age, there's let's say far greater frequency of hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions, not just in the Konya region, but also to the east. And we focused a lot of our time on the Kizildag, which is, we'll see, very close to a site, Turkmenkadahuyuk, that we worked extensively at. But we could see here a post-Hittite, right? So we're now a couple hundred years after the collapse of the Hittite Empire. We can see this king proclaiming himself great king through this particular inscription and relief at the spectacular landscape monument in the Konya Plain. So what city did the great king Hartapu build? This, I think, it answered itself pretty clearly through our own field work beginning in 2019. So Turkmenkadahuyuk is a site that we had been interested in from the very beginning. It is an enormous Huyuk settlement mound, tell in the Konya Plain. Within sight, we'll see, we can see sort of Kizildag in the background. So the Kizildag land feature is within sight. You can actually, if you can just make out Turkmenkadahuyuk from Kizildag, and it is huge. I mean, it is one of the largest. It is the largest settlement mound in the Konya region, larger than the famous like Çatalhöyük and some other places. So in 2019, this discovery was made. We weren't excavating. This was actually found at the base of a modern irrigation canal. You can see the arrow showing the location of the discovery of this particular inscription. And we see again Hartapu, the same Hartapu, almost certainly, who inscribed that monument looking down on the Konya Plain that we saw a couple slides earlier. So this is another, again, hieroglyphic Luvian inscription, probably almost certainly the same king who inscribed at and commissioned that monument in Kizildag. But again, we are a couple hundred years later than the collapse of the Hittite state and empire, but we'll come back to why we think this is significant in a moment. So we worked extensively at Turkmenkadahuyuk, including geophysical survey, of course, intensive artifact collection. And what is clear is that this was a site that was absolutely urban in scale from the Middle Bronze Age, definitely in the Late Bronze Age. So we're in Hittite, in the Hittite Empire period, and the Iron Age, of course, the date of the Hartapu inscription. So we are dealing now with a very, very large site, also in the Late Bronze Age, in a landscape that most people would associate with the entity Tarantasa, yet we still, of course, do not have the firm location. So this is the question. We don't have the answer. We are now working with this, what we call it a hypothesis, that we have a likely candidate, not necessarily, we haven't discovered Tarantasa, but we are certainly going forward with this question in mind. Is this indeed the Late Bronze Age city of Tarantasa that continued to be important enough to be the seat of this Iron Age king a couple hundred years later, Hartapu? Again, the site is enormous. It is an urban scale settlement. This is a likely candidate. We certainly have not. This is a question still, and it is definitely guiding our excavations planned for 2023. So we're putting in permits now to excavate, etc. So this is, under the same leadership, we are going to hopefully start that excavation in 2023 if we get the permit from the ministry. Okay, so the implications here now for the empire and the collapse, and this is now kind of wrapping things up. there is a great deal, if we go from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, what we see in the Konya region and further east is what we can describe as resiliency. The late Bronze Age, there's continuity from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age in the Konya Plain. We're seeing this in our settlement patterns. We're seeing this in the archaeology, where there does not appear to be some catastrophic break of urban settlement, urban Sikh settlement in the Konya Plain, the region just south of the land of Hatti, whereas in the land of Hatti, it is complete and total break. It is a catastrophic collapse, abandonment, and nothing, for example, Hattusa itself, after the collapse, is not revisited in any monumental sense ever again, right? So there is a sort of collapse event in continuity to the north, and what we're seeing now in the region that is closest, let's say, to the land of Hatti is a great deal of continuity in the archaeological patterns, of course, in the hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions, etc. So the distinction here is between a kind of resilience and continuity south of the land of Hatti and the collapse phenomenon in the land of Hatti. So there are various ways. This is, of course, this could be, several talks. Why did things go so wrong? There are numerous books written about this, not just, of course, for the Hittites, but for the Mycenaeans and the retreat to Egypt, the Cyprus. All the whole region, of course, as many of you know, suffered. At least the political elites suffered a catastrophic collapse, or even a decline and collapse around 1200 to about 1180 BC. And if we're going to sort of try to contextualize it for the Hittites, I think there are a couple of considerations. For those of you that have any historical understanding, we can sort of dismiss sea peoples or anything like that as a very unlikely cause for any sort of collapse in this land-based empire. But what I want us to think about is how, and what are some of the consequences of imperialism when all of these populations are sort of being deported into the land of Hatti. What sorts of social, political, even ideological consequences are we dealing with when you have this uprooted population that is seemingly becoming a majority of the people who live in this landscape? But then there's the matter of climate as well, and this is, I think, now a very reliable understanding or approach to this problem. There's all kinds of climate science coming out of that period around 1200 BC. There is absolutely a warming event. There is absolutely a drought. And from sources that many of you will be aware of, or at least the specialists in the audience, from places like Ugarit and from, of course, Hatti, we get a sense of a famine and a panic situation at the very end of the Hittite state and empire. So there's a climate approach to this problem, I think, that is real, but I think there's also a sort of socio-political approach or even cultural approach to this problem. Ultimately, this sort of unstable, very little resiliency, very little sort of cultural rootedness, if we want to say that, in the land of Hatti, that I think also has something to do with this collapse phenomenon. And so, again, the distinction here is between where we see continuity and resilience, where the Luvian inscriptions continue through history into the 8th century. We have settlement patterns in the Konya Plain, just south of the land of Hatti, which is showing, I think, very clearly that there was no such collapse in this region. The collapse was of the Hittite state and empire. The Hittites retreated, Luvian culture, etc., language even continued in this landscape. And that is the end of the Hittites and the end of my talk, so thank you very much.
Christoph, thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating lecture. We have some time now for some questions. Just to have a microphone. If anyone has a question, do raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you very much. A great lecture.
Thank you.
Can I ask you, are either Nessite or Luvian, are they roughly in the Semitic family of languages?
No.
So what?
So Indo-European. Indo-European. So perhaps our Indo-European specialists would like to comment more, but the closely related Indo-European languages. So there are three known languages spoken in the late, or at least recorded, let's say, in the late Bronze Age. There is Nessite. The reason it's called Nessite is because in the Middle Bronze Age there was an important city in the land of Hatti called Nessa, the Kotepe Kanesh. Those of you who know the history, the famous Assyrian trading colony in Cappadocia was Nessa, and the language Nessite is named after that place. So, and then there is Luvian, and then Palaic, and they're all closely related Indo-European languages. I mean, it's not dialects, I mean, they're distinct languages. But I think the common understanding is that there was some, in the third millennium maybe, there was a shared language, Proto-Indo-European, we can call it that sort of diverged into these three languages by the middle of the second millennium. Okay. But Indo-European rather than...
Thank you very much.
Mm.
Fascinating lecture, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do we see any remnants of Hittite culture in modern-day Turkey in terms of art, culture, music, textiles? What do we see today that links us back to that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and that's something that's another a question I address, in the sort of the heritage. In my own research, sort of the heritage of the Hittites, where do we see it? Well, where we see it mostly is in as a national project, right? So you can imagine when Ataturk established the Republic of Turkey, he needed a civilization that wasn't Ottoman, that wasn't Greek, that wasn't Roman, right? It couldn't be, for the reasons that are historically pretty, very apparent. He needed something that predated all of these other civilizations, right? It couldn't be Ottoman. Of course, it couldn't be Greek. It couldn't be, Italic Roman. It had to be the Hittites. So if you go to, Ankara, for example, and you're walking down Ankara, there's, of course, if you've ever been there, these boulevards, very 1930s, boulevards, with Hittite monuments dominating the cityscape. At least up until Erdogan. Of course, Erdogan has now sort of distanced himself from anything Ataturk, right? But up until Erdogan, the ministers would wear little things on the lapels with Hittite, representations of Hittite monuments and things, right? There's something actually from Al-Ajahir particularly, which became a symbol of Ataturk's republic. So the Hittites, I think, are still very much part of a republican, secular, sort of state ideology, which of course Erdogan has no relationship with at all, right? So I think that's probably where you see it most prominently. But of course there is, well, anyway, yes. I mean, to answer your question, that is where it's most prominent. Yeah, thank you.
I've just been reading an interesting book by a man named Hyam, who has been studying the Bronze Age in Thailand.
Okay.
And I gained the impression that the technology, bronze technology, was initially developed somewhere in the eastern steppe region.
You mean the metallurgical bronze? Is that what you're... Okay.
Is there any assumption, considering these languages are Indo-European, that the original Nessa dynasty arrived from elsewhere with bronze technology, and that's how they were able to dominate the region?
Yes, I mean, this is something that actually, so that very idea, so the Central Asian steppe, I think, is where, in fact, that if you look at this is a kind of part of the national discourse of the Hittites, right? So we're still coming back to the question about how the Hittites play out in culture and society today. So in the national discourse, the Hittites derive from Central Asia, right? And there have been decades of literature that are making very similar associations between nomadism from the central steppe, right? These sort of nomadic cultures, possibly metallurgy, moving in from Central Asia into what is today Anatolia. The problem, however, is that that works okay, of course, for the Seljuks, for the Ottomans. That did happen. There's, at the moment, no evidence, really, that Bronze Age people migrated out of Central Asia or the steppe region into Anatolia. This is, indeed, another one of the big questions that are not resolved. So I mentioned this linguistic substrate, right? There is so coming back to Indo-European, there is a non-Indo-European linguistic substrate in the Hittite text corpus, right? There are people called Hattic who spoke this language that are non-Indo-European, and then there is the superstrate of Indo-European. So that is a question that is still being debated. Was there actually a migration? Was there something sort of more diffuse? Was it trade or some sort of other interactions? Certainly having to do with metallurgy, right? I mean, that, of course, facilitates a lot of interaction across regions and between regions. But it is one of the great unresolved questions. Did the Hittites come from somewhere, right? If there is this linguistic substrate, was there a migration? I think I come from a tradition where I'm a little wary around migration explanations, but we can't rule it out. Something happened to cause this linguistic phenomenon, right? Yeah.
Because obviously, once everyone has your new technology, you've seriously lost advantage, haven't you?
Yes. I mean, I see where you're going with that. Yes. I mean, actually, again, if we think about where the Hittites most feature in kind of global discourses of metallurgy, they're actually associated more with iron. Because they weren't smelting iron, they were using meteoric iron all the way into the early Bronze Age. So that is, again, we don't see a lot of iron weaponry, but it was something they were doing. And a lot of people that try to explain these big patterns go to iron as a possible explanation along the lines you're describing, that they were the first ones to work meteoric iron into weaponry. But I don't know. I'm not sure.
I think we have time for one more question before we...
Yes. It says, yes. Your work stressing the study of the victors over the Hittites, would this be worrying to those traditionalists in Turkey? For I rapidly learned when I first went to Ankara that I should not describe myself as a classical archaeologist. It meant something totally different there. But if you're going to find more and more about the people who defeated the Hittites, is that going to be inconvenient with you or not, perhaps with Erdogan? And one little question, the references to a ship and famine bringing in, were these reports controlled by the Hittites on the south coast, presumably? Do we know where that was?
Yes.
That's a detailed
I'll just see if I can pull up a map and see if Ura is, there it is. So Ura is the so for example, in correspondences between Ugarit, which is of course on the coastal northern Levant, and the Hittites say Ura is the primary port, right? Which you can see there. So, and Tarsus probably also would have been a primary port, but Ura certainly. But coming back to your first question, yes, I think you have a point, because to this day, there is an unwillingness to, so all Luvian inscriptions, for example, are described as Hittite, right? There is a general unwillingness, I think, to decouple Luvian from Hittite in what you're describing, the kind of traditional, this isn't of course, but the kind of nationalist wing of archaeology in Turkey would probably be more reluctant to decouple Luvian from Hittite. Right, all of the inscriptions, even the Iron Age ones, are still called Hittite. And so potentially there might be a problem there, but not a big one, I think. I think now that kind of nationalist wing, that is of a generation that they're all retiring. They're all going away. Certainly of my generation, the archaeologists of my generation, it would not have so much of an issue. But you're right that Luvian and Hittite, for many archaeologists working in Turkey, and indeed the heritage sector of Turkey, they are inseparable. And so to say that somehow Luvians conquered the Hittites or whatever wouldn't. You're right. To some audiences, it wouldn't bode well. Yeah.
Christoph, thank you again for a talk which I think had something for non-experts like myself and for those of us in the audience who do know a great deal about this region and time. We will go now for drinks in the buttery. I think Christoph has more than earned it, and I hope if there are any other questions, you might be able to chat in person to him there. But before we go, join me once again in